Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks from Braintree High School. Today we are going to be talking about the Freedom Summer, just one of the many major battles of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights era in the 1960s. So we're going to get at it, see if we can't understand the events, and maybe even curate a few lessons that we can apply to the modern day. So let's talk Freedom Summer. Now, the civil rights movement, or at least that the modern civil rights movement, a major mantra of it is freedom is not free. There is going to be some level of sacrifice in order to secure freedom, and that is huge to understand when it comes to democracy. There's going to be many battles, as again shown during the civil rights movement. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education was one. 55, the Montgomery bus boycott began. Another major battle in 1957, the Little Rock Nine. 1960, James Meredith is going to battle to get an Ole Miss. In 1960, the sit-ins are going to occur all around Nashville. In 1960, the Freedom Rides are going to be happening as well. In 1963, in Birmingham, there's going to be a major protest. That's going to be really one of the major catalysts for getting rid of segregation across the country. And in 64, another battle, which we're going to talk about today, is going to take place in Mississippi, and that's going to be the Freedom Summit. So this is going to be an organized long-term event. It's got nothing to do with the Supreme Court, well, something to do with it, but or lunch counters or buses or schools. It's more directly connected to the concept of voting, trying to overcome voting. So why does voting matter so much? Why was this a huge point in the civil rights movement? Well, number one, if you can vote, which African Americans traditionally in the South could not, you could control government, and government impacts your life in so many ways. Number two, in the South, particularly, police chiefs are often elected, and how the police interact with people, particularly African Americans, was very crucial. A lot of abuse going on. So if people could vote, they could vote for a much more fair police chief. Number three, serving on juries was directly related to whether you could vote or not. The voting pools provided the jury pools. And in the South, that meant all juries were white in most states. And so that those juries are going to determine who gets imprisoned or who gets freed. And so often, a white person would be accused of a crime of hurting an African American person, and they would always go free. This is going to be, if you're going to have laws and abuse, all the fact that all the juries were white, critical change that needs to happen. Number four, why does voting matter? Well, we talked about controlling government, but it's not just controlling the politician, it's controlling the laws they create, because politicians come and go. Those laws can be abusive for a very long time. So, and those laws control people, and African Americans were controlled in very abusive ways according to those laws. Number five, when you can vote, if African Americans could secure the right to vote, that means the politicians chase after you vote, and that's going to change what is going on in your society. If you can't vote, you get ignored, and African Americans had been ignored for a long time. Now, voting is important for those five reasons, but why Mississippi? Why did the Freedom Summer target Mississippi? And the answer is there was massive income disparity in Mississippi, more so than other states, between white and black Americans. Number two, thousands of arrests, imprisonments, loss of freedom for African Americans. Number three, 65 unsolved bombings or burnings in Mississippi. Number four, hundreds of beatings, endless amount of beatings of African Americans, and just the violence that the government was allowed to perpetuate towards its African American citizens. Number five, just the etiquette alone was unacceptable and more extreme than other southern states. Do you know if you were walking on a sidewalk and you saw an African American, if you saw a white person coming, an African American would have to cross the street. You'd have to tip your hat. All of the interactions were condescending. It was clear that white people were still the master race and in charge and so on. And if you didn't follow that etiquette, you would be punished. Number six, again, why Mississippi? Well, African Americans couldn't vote. 6.7% of all the African Americans in the state were registered to vote. And that is a massively low percentage right there. The rest of the South, as racist and terrible as it was, 50 to 60% of African Americans were registered. Now, that wasn't good or great, but it at least was significantly better than what was in Mississippi, about 7%. So the activists are like, we have to target Mississippi. We do. Now, Mississippi's perspective was, well, some of their counties were African Americans made up a majority of their people. And if they got the right to vote, then white people would start to get punished, punished so badly by African Americans. If African Americans got the right to vote, the white Southerners would lose everything. They would be attacked, and they'd even have to move and lose their homes. So Mississippi was like, this was going to be the end of their world if African Americans got the right to vote, given what percentage of the state was African American. Another perspective of Mississippi was that much of the rest of the country was like, African Americans should vote, they should be equal, they should have equal rights. And Mississippi was like, no, you don't get it. African Americans in other states are educated, they're more similar to white people. African Americans in Mississippi are significantly less educated, they're backward, they can't handle rights, they shouldn't be able to vote. Economically speaking, they're somewhat helpless. So no, they're not equal and should not be put on the par of white people in Mississippi. To some extent, that wasn't entirely untrue. It's in large part because Mississippi denied equal education to African Americans or any programs to support them post slavery to help them get up to the education level and standard of living level of white people in Mississippi. Number three, again, this common theme throughout the civil rights movement, people in Mississippi said African Americans in Mississippi are happy. We shouldn't change anything. They don't want to vote. They're happy exactly where they are. It's only these outside agitators, these African Americans from the rest of the country, or white Americans, that are messing with the minds of African Americans here. Here in Mississippi, white people are happy, black people are happy. Let's keep things the same. So those are a lot of why Mississippi resisted this change of giving white people, African Americans, the right to vote. So what tactics is Mississippi going to use to resist this movement, the civil rights movement, this movement of change? Well, they're gonna battle. And one of the things they did was they founded the White Citizens Council, which was basically an informal economic alliance of all the white people that owned businesses. And white people ran the police, they ran the insurance companies, the hotels, the stores. And ultimately, what they did was that, forget the law, but if you joined the civil rights movement and battled, they were going to, not give you a loan to buy a car. They were going to not let you stay in their hotels. They were going to deny you rent, kick you out of your home. Because just about everything was owned by white people. So they figured that informal prejudice would be a way to attack leaders of the civil rights movement. And they were right. So you wouldn't be able to get that bank loan, or your business then wouldn't be able to exist. You would lose your job. You wouldn't be able to rent places. So you'd lose just about everything. And that was the tactic, economic pressure of the White Citizens Council. Also, the Mississippi felt like they had to battle. So they did with literacy tests. That if you wanted to vote, then you had to prove you could read and write. But a white racist would be the one correcting the test. And the white racist would often close the office if they saw you coming. So you wouldn't even be able to attempt to register. And hence, so it didn't matter how smart you were, if you were an African American, you were not going to be able to register to vote. And that meant your people had no power. Often as a punishment, retribution, if you even tried to register to vote, or if you did vote, your name would be published in the newspaper along with your address to basically invite all the white racists to come to your home, really hurt you, intimidate you. KKK, please take notice. So pretty awful thing. Another example of how Mississippi decided to battle, and I do mean white Mississippi, was the poll tax. The poll tax, which would later get banned in, I think, 1964, the poll tax would charge money if you wanted to vote. And of course, African Americans in Mississippi disproportionately were poor and couldn't afford to pay for that. So, I mean, that was an awful choice. And of course, you didn't have to just pay a tax when you wanted to vote. For every year you were eligible to vote, you had to pay for those years too to catch up. That would include the previous year and the previous years. And if you were 40, it'd be like a solid 20 years, right? So, that's a lot of money. That was preventing African Americans from voting. It was nearly impossible. So Mississippi kept battling, and of course the KKK would interact. If anybody tried to vote or push against the system or fight against the system, the KKK, hooded or otherwise, would come up and burn a torch on your yard, or do worse, murder, kill, lynch. And that's going to be, that violence is not just going to work against the people that experienced the violence, but everybody else who knew if they did anything out of the ordinary, they might face violence. And any parents that had kids didn't want to put their kids through that. There were over 500 lynchings, unsolved in Mississippi. So the KKK intimidation was a real thing. So Mississippi was doing a lot of things to battle. So the Freedom Summer is going to come along, we're going to be like, and that movement's going to be like, all right, we're taking on the worst state, the state that has the most rigid system of segregation, is the most oppressive system. So who led this movement? Well, in 1964, the NAACP, CORE, SCLC, and SNCC, the four most major civil rights organizations, are actually going to combine together and work together to lead the Freedom Summer to take on Mississippi. And the leader is going to be SNCC. Those young students, they're going to be the ones doing most of the work. So that said, SNCC stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It, of course, was founded after the sit-in movement in Nashville, Tennessee, but it will expand. And they were the leaders of the sit-in movement. They were the ones that came in after CORE left the buses for the freedom rides. They're going to see it through. So SNCC believed that if you could crack Mississippi, you could crack the whole South. Famous phrase. Like, Mississippi was the hardest system of segregation. If they could win there, they could win anywhere, right? Some forward momentum. So in 1964, it's going to be a long journey, but it is going to start with recruiting. The idea was that SNCC was going to recruit on college campuses. Specifically, they were going to have people fill out applications, and they did, to join the Freedom Summer movement. So it was going to, they even had job interviews, and they didn't want crazy people that were willing to do anything to help civil rights. They wanted people that were cold and calculated so they wouldn't look bad. So once again, they would handle, because if you went into Mississippi just really, really aggressive, you're going to get yourself killed. So they didn't want that. They also didn't want selfish people that were looking just to check a box that they were good people. They wanted people that, were willing to do the right thing for the right reasons. And weren't against filling out paperwork. They didn't have to be on the front lines. They didn't want people that had to be heroes. So they did those interviews for that reason. Now, the objectives of the Freedom Summer, number one, was they were trying to get about 1,000 students to go down to Mississippi to basically help register those people and get them to vote. Now, the Black community would house these 1,000 people and give them food. They would be all across the state. Number two goal of the Freedom Summer was the objective was to get attention, call attention that Mississippi was the worst state as far as equal rights and equity, that those people were being harmed, and the African Americans in Mississippi, they were so harmed they could no longer be ignored, and so on. So those 1,000 students often were supposed to be white. They were recruited because they were white, because the theory was that much of white America didn't care that African Americans were suffering, but if they brought white people down there and those white people were suffering and saw that this violence, then white America would care, and it would get their attention. Number three, once America's attention was gotten by these 1,000 essentially white volunteers going down to be in Mississippi, now all of a sudden America would get angry because they would see how bad Mississippi was in terms of equity. How could America not care once their attention was drawn? Number four, part of the Freedom Summer was that African Americans and white Americans that were part of the Freedom Summer would go down and knock on African American doors, and they would talk to the people there and ask them to register to vote, and even help them if they couldn't read and write, fill out the forms, and even walk them down to show them where the poll place was. Now, you have been slaves too long. We can help you help yourselves, was a mantra, common thing said to these people. So there they are, the members of the Freedom Summer, going to talk to people saying, you should register to vote. Come on. A lot of times, often a white and black member of the Freedom Summer would be paired. There they are discussing with the homeowner. Now, the idea was that if they could get tens of thousands of African-American Mississippi people registered, they could start to have leverage and power because of voting. And they could kick their racist white politicians out, or at least get people that were less racist, right? Balance the ticket. Because if you have enough African-Americans voting, those politicians are going to have to change their tune a little bit towards equity. And also to get rid of the laws. Once you control the politicians, you can get rid of the racist laws. And that was the goal. Register people to vote, take democracy back. Number five aspect of the Freedom Summer was African American schools were absolutely awful, terrible. Almost no money was given to them to help the African American children learn. And they certainly weren't allowed to in white schools. So that said, because Mississippi, of course, had not done any type of good job of desegregating at this point. So those children were suffering, and perpetual cycle of poverty went on. So that said, the Freedom Summer tried to establish freedom schools. They would establish freedom schools that at night and over the weekends and over the summer, that basically African Americans would be taught by these well-educated college kids that had come from nowhere. And those freedom schools would balance things off. This is an example of a freedom school. A lot of times African American history would be taught, trying to inspire self-worth, and it would just make the people of Mississippi smarter. And that can have all types of positive ramifications. So number six, part of the Freedom Summer is they would also try to create freedom libraries. So even when the schools were gone, they would still be a place for African Americans to acquire knowledge because they often weren't allowed in the white libraries and so on. Part of the white strategy was to keep African Americans ignorant and uneducated, and then therefore easier to control, right? You don't have to treat people equally if they're not literally equal. So those freedom libraries were established. Once again, working at building up the skill level of African Americans. Now, the beginning of the Freedom Summer. On June 13th, 1964, there's going to be an orientation in Oxford, Ohio, and over 1,000 recruits are going to be there. They're going to get trained in all the ways that are civil rights. The idea being that civil disobedience, you have to conduct yourself in a positive and nonviolent way, and that takes training. Here's one leader of SNCC trying to educate all the recruits and tell them how they have to act and behave and how dangerous this was. On June 15th, 1964, training was over and 1,000+ people went down to Mississippi. On June 15th, 1964, this is the third day of the Freedom Summer, just at the time where everybody's getting settled. They're moving to the different parts of the state. They're meeting their families, and the phone rings, and that a church has been caught on fire. It's been burnt to the ground. So 3 leaders of the Freedom Summer, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, they go and they get in a car and they want to go investigate. So they're going to investigate what happened to figure out what their response would be. The next morning, they don't call in. They're missing. They're gone. And that starts to make people freaked out. Like, where are they? 3 days later, they find a station wagon, their station wagon, completely torched and burnt out on the side of the road. Now people know that they're probably dead and gone. Very sad thing, but they continue to search. Of course, the people of Mississippi do very little to do anything. They're like, oh, they're probably just gone, having a good laugh of things. We heard a similar thing about Emmett Till once. So instead, the federal government has to intervene, and they begin to, Lyndon Johnson sends people down to help out and look for the bodies of these three Freedom Summer advocates. So anyway, after 7 weeks, they eventually find their bodies in an earthen dam. This is what it literally looks like. And they dig up and they find their bodies in a shallow grave. That would be them. So what happened? Well, we know now that the KKK had heard about the Freedom Summer. Once again, I mean, they were recruiting people from all over the country. Part of what the civil rights movement does is they grab attention, so they publicize their activities. And they had heard this, the KKK did, that the Freedom Summer was coming. Now, if we read this together, this was an example of the KKK addressing its members. Basically, he describes this as a communist black invasion of Mississippi that he expected to take place in a few weeks. He was right, in what CORE had announced as the Freedom Summer. This summer, the enemy will launch his final push for victory in Mississippi. There must be a secondary group of our members armed and ready to move. It must be an extremely swift, extremely violent hit-and-run group. In other words, if these people are going to invade Mississippi trying to mess with their heritage, they had to strike back to win this war. So the perspective of the KKK was Mississippi was under attack. It was a rumor that 30,000, not 1,000, but 30,000 protesters were going to come down to Mississippi to try to change their way of life. Edgar Ray Killen is going to be one of the leaders of this group. He's going to recruit 10 men to strike back, and they burn the church down to lure them in because these 3 gentlemen wanted to set up a freedom library in that area. So at that point, of course, the KKK didn't want anything to do with this. So they were going to burn down the church, so they'd come back to lure them in, and that's exactly what happened. They went to investigate, and the police deputy at this time, Ray Rice, is going to pull them over. Now, this was a very spelled out plan. They knew they were coming, and he was waiting for them. He pulled them over for going 65 miles per hour in a 35. Then arrests them and locks them up for a few hours, and then says, you can go. Now, during these few hours, those 10 men gathered that were going to kill them. And as they drive away, he pulls them over again after following them, and this time the 10 men are there. They come over, and those 10 men, these are the 10 men, they're going to basically intimidate and bring the 3 Freedom Summer workers, and they're going to bring them Rock Cut Road, which is not that far from there, and then they start beating and hurting them. Specifically, Chaney is going to be beaten and mutilated. He's going to have parts of his body cut off. Alton Roberts, one of the 10 men, is going to fire at all 3 of those men and ultimately shot 2 of them, Goodman and Schwerner, through the heart, and then going to bury them at Old Jolly Farm. And Andrew Goodman, after the autopsy, is going to have dirt in his lungs. So it is likely that he was buried alive after being shot through the heart. Deputy Cecil Pierce, this is what he says afterwards. Well, boys, you've done a good job. You've struck a blow for the white man. Mississippi can be proud of you. You've let those agitating outsiders know where the state stands. Go home now and forget it. But before you go, I'm looking each one of you in the eye and telling you this. The first man who talks is dead. If anybody who knows anything about this ever opens his mouth to any outsider about it, then the rest of us are going to kill him just as dead as those son of a bitches tonight. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? The man who talks is dead, dead, dead. Now, that's what he said to that group. So that said, were they ever caught? The FBI did search, and they searched for these 3 bodies for those 7 weeks. And during that time, they actually found 8 random bodies of 8 other people that were killed. And the excuse at this point was they're just hiding and trying to cause a lot of bad publicity for this part of the state. And of course, that wasn't true, because we eventually found the 3 bodies of the Freedom Summer people, right? 44 days later. Now, how did they find out? Well, the FBI did issue a $25,000 reward, and ultimately somebody did come forward to claim the money and became an FBI informant. And they ultimately said that the bodies were at Old Jarley Farm. Most of the people involved eventually were convicted, and when you got a couple people that were involved, they would rat on the others, and ultimately they got most of them arrested, at least out of those 8. Federally speaking. So the Freedom Summer did continue. They got about 1,600 people registered. That wasn't a lot, but at least it was something, right? And part of the reason was most were homeowners, and they were worried that their address would be published in the paper, and they were worried about their kids getting attacked or hurt, or their homes being burnt down, or they'd be losing their job, having no food to feed their families. So many were like, no, I don't care who you are, we're not going to go register to vote. The Freedom Summer movement did build 50 libraries, which will help with education, and that's a positive thing. They did have 41 Freedom Schools to help people get past that minimum level of education. And they're going to help over 3,000 students. That's, of course, only going to last for one summer, but it's a good summer and a good step. So the Freedom Summer had one more goal. There was one more aspect of Freedom Summer beyond Freedom Schools, Freedom Libraries, and registering people to vote, and that was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And this is the most complicated thing that was going on. So in 1964, you have to remember the top goal of Freedom Summer was voting and voting rights. And in 1964, there was a presidential election between the Democrats and the Republicans, where and of course, each party has to pick one person to run for office, right? One person to represent their party to run in the general election so the American people can vote for who they want for president. But our system is a little more complicated than that. There's a lot of Democrats that want to be that one person, a lot of Republicans that want to be that one person. So what happens is all the Democrats and all the Republicans that want to run for president to be that one person, they have a pre-election called a primary the year before the election. All 50 states basically have a primary for the most part, where the candidates within a party get to battle there, and all the Democrats in one state get to pick which Democrat they want in that primary. And all the Republicans in that same state have a pre-election where they get to pick which Republican they want. And ultimately, the winner of when any candidate wins a state in their primary, that state, they get to then pick the delegates from that state that go to the convention at the end of the year, where they actually do pick who goes. So what do I mean? Every state has a primary vote, and a Democratic candidate going against other Democrats. Whoever wins most of those votes, those states will send people representing that candidate to the national convention. Now, so if you win most of the primaries, most of the people at the national convention, a big 4-day party, are going to be your people, because most of the people there got there because you won the primaries. So those people pick the winner, who's going to represent the party, who's going to run in the general election. So that's a lot of positive. That's a positive thing, that there's a primary in every state where Democrats and Republicans get to battle it out within their own party. But the problem is, in places like Mississippi, which are 45% African American, the Mississippi delegation, which is going to be sent by the winner of the Mississippi primary, is going to be all white. So remember, it's a segregated society. So the Democratic delegates were all white, and they have 64 seats at the Democratic National Convention, which chooses which Democrat's going to run for president in 1964. So this is a problem, right? Mississippi is 45% African American, yet the people going from Mississippi to go pick the presidential nominee are not. They're all white. So a member of the Freedom Summer, one of its leaders is somebody by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer is going to be, on August 6, 1964, said, we got to fix this situation. So she goes to Jackson, Mississippi, the capital. She calls all of her people there, and they have their own little convention, the Freedom Democratic Party State Convention. Only this one's not the official one. And this one has both white and black people represented by the Freedom Summer. So ultimately, they picked 62 delegates, both black and white. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that's this group, they go all the way to Atlantic City. That's where the 4-day national convention is for the Democrats, where each state sent their delegates. And of course, the delegates were whoever won that primary from that state. And so all of a sudden at the Democratic National Convention, you have all these delegates of the various candidates. And the Mississippi delegation is, again, all white. So when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party comes in, they basically say, no, you don't represent Mississippi. We do. We're the real delegates from Mississippi. Get out of here. So how does the Democratic Party react to Mississippi having two opposite sets of delegates, both claiming to be representing the Democratic Party of Mississippi? Well, they look at both groups and they say, well, the official group is not Fannie Lou Hamer, it's not the Freedom Summer people. So they tell them to go home. They don't allow them in. And so now the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is upset. They spend the 4 days protesting. This is an example of them protesting and trying to gather attention and being upset. And they're making a lot of noise, and it's not making the Democratic Party look good. And the Democratic Party is being accused of being racist, and that's not okay. So at this point, this is how negotiations begin, right? You start making the Democrats look bad. So they negotiated with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and ultimately the Democratic Party offers them two representative seats that can vote for who the Democrats pick for their presidential candidate in 1964. Now, the all-white Mississippi delegation has 64 seats compared to the two. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party takes a look at this and is like, well, we'll get our foot in the door, but they reject it. They say this is unbelievably racist and unfair. No. So for 4 days, again, after 4 days, the convention's over. All 50 states had sent delegates, including the all-white delegation of Mississippi. They voted Lyndon Baines Johnson to be their representative. But it doesn't matter because this was basically all white people picking him, at least for Mississippi. So this is considered a failure by the Democratic Mississippi Democratic Party, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Excuse me. No change happens. Now, weirdly enough, they did call enough attention, and they received promises that 4 years later, in the next presidential election, Mississippi would do a better job of having a diverse Democratic Party. And they will. In the 1960 election, it will be a integrated Democratic Party for that convention. So was the Freedom Summer successful? Well, one can argue that this put a spotlight on the South, particularly Mississippi. Most Americans have their own things going on, but this paid their attention, particularly with the murders. So now people are watching Mississippi and demanding change, and that's good. Now that attention has been gotten, the movement grows, and it grows like bacteria, right? And people join because they see how bad the South of Mississippi is. And this leads to a growth of power. The civil rights movement gets donations of money, but also donations of people, and that is power. Now remember the rule, you need to get to 51% support in order to pass laws. And things like the murders of the Freedom Summer and the struggles they had are going to get to that 51%. And the year before, there was the Civil Rights Act of 64 that banned segregation, but now we're going to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Remember, the goal of Mississippi was to register people to vote, and people got murdered and killed over it. And so this is going to draw people's attention to be like, no, they should have the right to vote. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 will be passed because of the support drummed up by the Freedom Summer and other moments in the movement. And suddenly literacy tests, which were the primary way African Americans were prevented from voting in Mississippi, are now banned. You can't do them anymore, or the FBI will come down and take over your government. So that's a very positive thing. Now, one can argue that there are still obstacles in the way of African Americans voting, that society is not perfect or even necessarily fair or equitable, but the Freedom Summer provided a step in the right direction, and it provided a huge step towards getting the Voting Rights Act passed. And that was a huge victory and an accomplishing of a major objective for African Americans in the civil rights movement. and American society itself. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we have a better understanding of what happened with the Freedom Summer and its ramifications of how things changed. Hopefully you saw a fair number of the tactics that were used in the Freedom Summer, and those can be applied to future protests that this country will need. We are always striving for better equity, and hopefully we can drive some of those lessons. Thank you for listening, and have a fabulous day.